The machines kept their rhythm long after the people in the room had stopped believing in it. A steady beep, a steady hiss, the small mechanical insistence that a body was still alive even when every doctor standing around the bed had quietly decided that alive was not the same as present. The boy in the bed was 9 years old. His name was Atlas Calloway, and 3 days earlier he had been pulled from the deep end of his father's pool by a gardener who heard nothing, saw nothing, and would spend the rest of his life grateful that he happened to glance through a window at exactly the wrong right moment. The doctors called it anoxic brain injury. They used careful words around his father, words like significant and prolonged, and we have to prepare for outcomes that are difficult to hear. His father heard none of the carefulness. He heard only the shape of the sentence, which was that his son might never open his eyes again. Before we continue, if you believe that the people the world overlooks are sometimes the ones holding the answer, please like this video, subscribe and share this with someone who needs a reason to believe in people today. His father's name was Holt Calloway, and he had built a logistics empire out of nothing but a single delivery van and a refusal to lose, 22 years before that morning. He had buried his wife 4 years earlier and had spent every day since trying to be enough for Atlas by himself, which mostly meant being extremely good at providing things and somewhat lost at providing presents. He stood at the foot of the hospital bed in a shirt he had been wearing for 3 days, watching a neurologist explain a prognosis that amounted to Hope politely declining to attend. Holt had once talked a board of investors out of pulling $40 million in a single afternoon. He had never once in his life felt as powerless as he did standing in that room, because for the first time, there was nothing to negotiate and no one to convince. The body in the bed did not respond to incentives. It only waited or did not. 3 floors below, in the hospital's East Wing cafeteria, a boy named Marcus sat in the corner booth nearest the heating vent, because it was the warmest place in the building that nobody asked you to leave if you sat quietly enough. He was 12, though he looked younger, with the kind of stillness that some kids develop early when noise has never done them any favors. He had been sleeping in the stairwell of a parking structure 2 blocks from the hospital for the last 5 months, ever since the apartment he shared with his mother lost its lease, and his mother went to stay with a cousin upstate while she tried to get back on her feet, leaving Marcus behind because the cousin's apartment had no room and Marcus had insisted, with a stubbornness that frightened her, that he would be fine on his own until she came back for him. He was not fine. He was getting by, which is a different thing entirely, and getting by mostly meant the hospital cafeteria during the day, where the staff had grown used to seeing him and had quietly decided not to mention it to anyone, and the stairwell at night, where he kept a sleeping bag a nurse named Felicia had given him without ever discussing why he might need one. Marcus had a single object that mattered to him beyond the sleeping bag. It was a paperback book on neuroscience, missing its cover, that he had found in a donation bin behind a community college 18 months earlier. He had read it so many times that entire passages existed in his memory the way songs exist in other people's, surfacing whole and uninvited at unexpected moments. He had become curious about the brain 2 years before that, when his little cousin had a seizure at a family gathering, and an off-duty EMT calmly took control of a room that had dissolved into panic, and Marcus watched the entire thing from a doorway, transfixed, and understood for the first time that the brain was not just where a person lived. It was the only thing that made a person at all, and that frightened and fascinated him in equal measure. He read what he could find after that. Library books before the library started asking questions about address verification he could not answer. Pamphlets in the hospital lobby. The torn paperback, read so many times the spine had given up entirely, and the pages were held together with packing tape he had taken from a dumpster behind a shipping store. He overheard the story the way most of the hospital eventually did, in fragments passed between nurses on break, in hushed exchanges near the vending machines. The billionaire's son, the pool, 3 days now and nothing. Marcus listened the way he listened to everything, quietly, retaining far more than anyone assumed a kid in a hoodie with mud on his shoes would retain. He did not think much of it at first. It was not his business, and he had learned the hard way that inserting yourself into things that were not your business rarely ended well for someone in his position. But on the fourth morning, passing the family lounge on the pediatric floor on his way to the cafeteria, he saw Holt Calloway through the window of the room, sitting beside the bed with his head down, not moving, and something about the stillness of it stopped Marcus in the hallway the way a sound might have. He stood there longer than he meant to. Then he noticed something nobody else in the room seemed to be tracking, because everyone else in the room had stopped tracking anything at all. The monitor showing intracranial pressure had ticked upward, almost nothing, a number most visitors would never have known to look at, let alone understand. Marcus knew, because his torn paperback had an entire chapter on exactly this, on the quiet danger of swelling that doctors call secondary injury, the kind that does its damage not at the moment of the accident but in the hours and days that creep along after, while everyone is still grieving the first injury and not yet watching for the second one. He did not go in right away. He stood at that window for almost 4 minutes, doing the thing he always did before deciding anything, which was to make sure he was not about to make a fool of himself over a misunderstanding. He was not wrong. The number kept climbing in tiny, deniable increments, the kind that do not trigger an alarm until they have already gone too far. He pushed open the door. Nobody in the room registered him at first, the way nobody ever quite registered him, until he walked directly to the monitor stand and said, in a voice that did not waver despite every instinct in his body telling him it should, his pressure's going up. You need to call someone now. A nurse turned, startled, already opening her mouth to ask who let this child wander into a critical care room. And that was the exact moment the bedside alarm began to sound, 3 seconds after Marcus said it, confirming a thing he had noticed before the machine designed to notice it had caught up. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be discussed in that hospital for years afterward. The room went from grief-stricken stillness to a controlled, practiced kind of chaos. A neurologist who had been 2 floors away arrived within minutes, because Marcus's warning had given the floor nurse enough lead time to page ahead instead of reacting cold. They moved fast in the way hospitals move when minutes are not a metaphor but a literal unit of brain tissue. Holt Calloway, still sitting beside the bed, looked up at the boy who had just spoken with more clarity than anyone else in the room and said the only thing his mind could produce in that moment, which was, "Who are you?" Marcus did not answer right away. He stepped back toward the door the way he always stepped back from things that were not his to stay for, and it was a nurse, not Marcus, who finally said his name out loud, because she was the only one in the room who already knew it. The swelling was caught early enough to manage without the kind of intervention that would have meant permanent and additional damage. Atlas did not wake up that day, or the next, but the surgeon who reviewed his scans 48 hours later told Holt plainly that the early catch had likely been the difference between recovery and an outcome nobody in that family would have survived intact. Holt asked repeatedly who had noticed it first, because the official chart simply listed the monitoring nurse, and the monitoring nurse, to her credit, corrected the record the first chance she got. She told him it was the boy, the one who sits in the cafeteria, the one everyone on this floor has been quietly looking out for since the spring. Holt found Marcus exactly where he always was, in the corner booth by the heating vent, working through a hospital cafeteria sandwich with the slow deliberateness of someone making it last. Holt did not sit down right away. He stood at the end of the table for a long moment, a man who had spent 2 decades being the most prepared person in every room he entered, now entirely out of any prepared thing to say to a 12-year-old in a hoodie. He finally asked how Marcus had known. Marcus told him about the book, the missing cover, the packing tape on the spine, the chapter on secondary injury that he had read so many times he could recite portions of it without trying. Holt asked where he lived, and Marcus, The way Kyle once had in a different hospital in a different story, but in the same spirit of refusing to perform an answer he did not owe anyone, told him the truth. The stairwell, the sleeping bag from a nurse. The mother upstate trying to get steady enough to come back for him. Holt did not flinch, and he did not reach immediately for his wallet the way some men in his position might have, mistaking money for the whole of an answer. He asked instead what Marcus wanted, which was a question almost nobody in 12 years had thought to ask him directly. What Marcus wanted, it turned out, was simple enough to say and difficult enough to have ever expected. He wanted to go back to school without anyone asking questions about an address he could not give. He wanted his mother to have a place steady enough that she would stop apologizing every time she called. He wanted, eventually, more of the book, the real one, not the donation bin copy with the missing cover, and all the books that came after it. Holt listened to every part of it without interrupting, and when Marcus finished, Holt said the same thing Garrison once said to a different boy in a different telling of this same human truth, that this would not be charity, that he had spent his career finding the rare thing in people and making room for it to grow, and that he had simply never expected to find it in a cafeteria booth 3 floors below his own son's hospital room. The arrangement that followed moved with the same quiet efficiency Holt brought to everything else in his life. Marcus's mother was found within the week, housed within the month, in an apartment Holt's foundation already managed for families in exactly her situation, close enough to the hospital that she and Marcus could be near each other again, without either of them having to explain anything to anyone. Marcus was enrolled in school under his own name, with his own history, with nobody requiring him to pretend any part of the last 5 months had not happened. He kept the torn paperback. Nobody suggested otherwise. He was given a tutor for the gaps the last several months of irregular schooling had left, and within a single semester those gaps had mostly closed, because it turned out the boy who had taught himself neuroscience from a book held together with packing tape did not need much help once someone simply gave him a clean place to sit and read. Atlas woke up 6 weeks later. The recovery was not instant and not complete in the way movies promise recoveries can be, but it was real, and it continued in the specific, grinding, hopeful way that real recoveries do, through physical therapy and small victories, and a father who finally understood that presence, not just provision, was the thing his son had actually been asking him for all along. When Atlas was strong enough to sit up and take visitors, the first person outside the family Holt brought into the room was Marcus, and the 2 boys, born into entirely different worlds by nothing more than the accident of which family had claimed them, became something like brothers over the following year, in the unhurried way that real friendships grow rather than the instant way stories sometimes pretend they do. Before we go further, we want to pause on something easy to miss in a story built around 1 dramatic minute in a hospital room. The minute mattered, but it did not arrive from nowhere. A donation bin behind a community college held onto a torn textbook instead of losing it to a landfill, and somebody loaded that bin instead of driving past it. A nurse named Felicia handed a sleeping bag to a kid. She was never assigned to help, and never once mentioned it to anyone who might have turned it into a problem for either of them. An off-duty EMT, years earlier, kept his hands calm during a family seizure instead of letting panic take the room, not knowing a child in a doorway was absorbing every motion he made as if it were the most important lesson of his life, because for that child, it was. None of those people were in the room when the monitor ticked upward. All of them were. The decision that saves a life is rarely made in the room where the life is saved. It is made earlier by someone who will likely never know what their small choice eventually became. A year after Atlas woke up, Marcus wrote 3 letters on the same night, sitting at his mother's kitchen table in the apartment that no longer needed apologizing for. He wrote to the community college, trying to trace the donation bin back to whoever had been emptying it that semester, and eventually, after several forwarded emails, found a retired professor who remembered clearing out his office, and simply could not bring himself to throw away a stack of old textbooks. So he gave them away instead and never thought of it again until a 12-year-old's letter arrived a year later describing exactly what one of those books had made possible. He wrote to Felicia, who had since transferred to a different hospital across the state, and who read the letter standing in her own kitchen and had to sit down halfway through it. And he wrote last to the off-duty EMT from the family gathering all those years earlier, a man named Desmond who had no idea a child in a doorway had been watching him that closely, and who, upon reading what his calm hands had eventually set in motion, told his own son that night that you genuinely never know who is paying attention when you think no one is. Holt Calloway still tells people, when they ask how his son survived an injury that should have ended very differently, that the real answer is uncomfortable for a man who built his fortune believing that almost every problem could be solved with enough money and enough force of will. The real answer is that his son is alive because a boy with no permanent address had spent 2 years reading a damaged book nobody else wanted, in a stairwell nobody else would have chosen, because curiosity had found him there and refused to let go. Never assume that a person sleeping somewhere unstable tonight knows nothing worth knowing. Never mistake a quiet kid in a corner booth for someone with nothing to offer the room. And never forget that the knowledge which saves a life sometimes spends years waiting in a donation bin, in a borrowed sleeping bag, in the patient and unglamorous attention of a child the world had not yet decided to notice. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to believe in people today. Because sometimes the difference between losing someone and keeping them does not arrive in a white coat. Sometimes it arrives in a torn hoodie, carrying a book with no cover, sitting quietly in the one corner of the room nobody thought to watch.